shortly. Give it a minute.
Alrighty. Well, welcome to the 3rd of June. God, how time flies and having fun. This and that information. As my usual little gig here. Just keep doing this. So we've been actually having some discussions about more movie showing. So perhaps during this time period or earlier or later, depends, we'll be showing a few more movies to watch together. Some of us have favorite movies we'd love to share with folks. And then those references often come up in our little things we do around here anyway, much like the musical references. And if you weren't with us last night, there was some really excellent, a new documentary, or not a new documentary, but we were treated to a 10-part, really interesting documentary on the thing that probably motivated us much earlier when we were much younger, and that is the foundations of rock and roll. And girl groups like the Shirelles, and if you haven't listened to them, well, more's the pity. On the same note, it appears that aside from the monopoly position of Ticketmaster, apparently they had a huge data breach. And I wonder whether it was a external hack or actually an internal phishing expedition that seized an incredible trove of personal data. So if you've bought a Ticketmaster ticket, you probably should check your stuff, check your data, because apparently they seized not only names and addresses and phone numbers, but credit card data. Just a word of warning for those of you who are Ticketmaster types. I've been writing off and on a thing about that from an antitrust point of view. Ticketmaster probably does need to be broken up, just for normal antitrust reasons. If you're a fairly normal capitalist, you would want Ticketmaster broken up. Anyway, egalitarian political projects. I look at Alain Badiou's work because he's an interesting Marxist, probably you would identify him as a tanky, except that he's a mathematician and has other stuff that he's got on his mind. And he puts theory into practice, and he's quite an interesting fellow. Although I think as with Zizek, et cetera, everyone's a little bit long in the tooth these days. But he's still there, and he's still important, and his books extend, I would assert, extend the continental philosophy interest that we've been looking at in a variety of ways, the difference between appearance and essence, or material reality and the appearance of things. And I like his work. It is tough to plow through, particularly if you're looking at the math, but it's really important to think about, because I think it is a way forward, as I've suggested in other venues, that we make kind of the data set intelligible to everyone. And the data set, the data set itself doesn't have politics. It's when it's turned into information that becomes problematic. So anyway, Badiou introduced a great deal of clarity into the debate over. This is the same article. Let me just intervene on myself again. The same article I've been looking at since yesterday. It's an article in Nature on a variety of things, but essentially explaining, why we are still interested in the commons and communism as a sort of idea about shared resources that help us distinguish between the private, the public, and the personal. And it's not it's not as simple as we think, because it does, as with Marx, deal with a lot of things that are philosophically important. That is that a modern world has a lot more movement and motion, more time and space. Well, more time and space. That's an interesting question, but radical emancipatory politics in the 20th century has certain kinds of dimensions built into it, ones that we reflect on in the 19th century as being important, still important, whether a revolutionary vanguard is important, whether a revolutionary rearguard becomes important, as we've seen in how various parties react to revolutionary activity. For example, we've been looking at Rosa Luxemburg for exactly that reason. That is the difference between the Democratic Socialists of Germany and the rise of Nazism, a problematic set of relations. On the one hand, it was in the beginnings of trying to reject the structures of a monarchist, government. It was a kind of liberal revolution that, with all due respect, wasn't strong enough to resist the rise of right-wing politics. And it certainly a cautionary note, and one that we followed up until the last decade, I suppose. And we see some twinklings of it again, particularly when you look back at the history, you begin to see some of the same elements at work, some of the same rhetoric, some of the same terms. I mean, fake news is not a new idea. Anyway, so 3 different dimensions of egalitarian political projects. Badiou, as a communist, is trying to essentially give us certain ideas about how we think about equality. And of course, there are details in it. There are always details. The idea of a distributive justice, that is, how is fairness arbitrated? Can we count on everyone to have the same degree of ideological faith in the equality of process? That's kind of hard. And as we've seen more recently, people will resist that, and up to and including the point of denying that the judicial system has any power at all, which is an interesting, problematic, if only because to disclaim it is simply only to ask to substitute a much more authoritarian version of unfairness. So there are 3 different dimensions that Badiou identifies: the communist hypothesis, a general and unlocalized commitment to the principle of equality. And it is a hypothesis, that is, that one that can and should be tested by reality. There is the idea of communism, that is this kind of conceptual notion that generates ideas, much like language itself. Different and situated formulations of this principle articulated under concrete historical constraints. So this is, you're trying to get this out to, a commitment is something that you can have as a kind of personal idea, personal kind of a commitment. But it is, of course, when you get it out there in reality, that it is can become incredibly difficult. And the communist experiments. And I want to mention this idea of trying these things out, because as we've looked at in the 19th century, there were utopian socialist experiments. The Paris Commune itself can be sort of considered as just simply a concretized example of that, revealed in revolt, revealed in resistance to the vestiges of the monarchy, all kinds of stuff going on at the same time, very problematic, and ultimately, with respect, fails, but not without making its mark in history, one that we continue to study. There are experiments of one kind or another. We can call them utopian socialism or a variety of other things. They get rebranded, of course, in the post-World War II era. I mean, but they've been around for a while. These ideas are there, and as I'll note in a personal side note, that they can be influential at many levels. Political sequences which put these different incarnations of the communist idea to the test, producing lasting examples and challenges for those who might seek to reformulate the hypothesis under new historical conditions later on. You could say that it's an idea of liberalism and to, you know, sort of propose it just simply as a trope, the end of history, that, you know, that we've achieved a certain degree of you know, capitalism has given us a certain modern, you know, kind of prosperity, etc. Well, I think that the climate crisis has sort of told us that that's not quite the way it should work out. But anyway, there's a chart, a schematization in this particular article, and it has negative and alternative hypotheses. And it is a kind of circular thing where you have affirmative hypothesis, it's dialectic in that sense, affirmative hypothesis, idea, experiment, negative hypothesis. This is the dialectic at work. It's a schematization of the distinction between a hypothesis, an idea, an experiment, and the critical assessment of the experiment, or the negative hypothesis that the experiment can lead to a new idea for a hypothesis. This is nothing new. This is essentially experimental procedures. You know, this is the way in which you build theory on the one hand. On the other hand, it is the way in which you test any kind of experiment, and a communist experiment is no different than any other. And we can see there's a history of failed communist experiments. One should really cop to it and not have to make up stories about it. We should come to that kind of realization. The affirmative hypothesis of communism is thus a statement that is totally devoid of concrete content. That is a purely philosophical defense of the possibility of thinking justice. So this is the meta of the kind of thing, the hypothesis that you are testing, because you test them. And of course, from a statistical point of view, you have questions of, positives and negatives and other kinds of testing problems, but it's not a kind of survey problem. It is, in fact, a kind of working through and, actually trying the stuff out, and not necessarily on small samples. This is a kind of much more global kind of problem, one that has whose experiments are causing, the Earth to warm up. The hypothesis as such says nothing of the historical existence of real equality, nor a concept of equality with which we could evaluate particular historical sequences. You can't, it's difficult. You can't sort of say, oh, well, we can just sort of ceteris paribus, sort of say, well, we can hold everything else constant and sort of work through this. No, it's constantly under evaluation. Only an idea can turn this wager into a formulation which, being woven out of concrete reality articulated within the limits of a given historical moment, would allow us to even ask if social equality under such and such conditions has taken place or not. So he's just simply asking, how is it that we're going to get false or positive, true or false negatives and positives out of this particular kind of problem. So, for example, what Marx and Engels called critical utopian socialism. This is an important thing because this is the 18th and 19th century sort of at work, trying to figure out what the best way to do things is, whether it's Robert Owen, in terms of work, or Saint-Simon, or Charles Fourier, trying to figure out, well, what is the ideal community, or a more idealized or more workable kind of community size that can guarantee such equalities, because it is that equality question that is sort of, there. And yet, how is it that you're going to get it when everyone is holding on to their land, holding on to their royalty titles or their stuff, whatever. All of these things are at work. And needless to say, power is, not leveled. It was by considering the brute social reality of early capitalism that these political thinkers defended that another sort of communal life was possible. Unlike both the communities organized under decaying feudal rule and the emerging civilized world of the bourgeois cities. So people, they they had this image of it. You could go to the arts and crafts movement to see that that was happening. On the one hand, there was, you know, the sort of petty bourgeois and bourgeois developments that come from going to Oxford, living in the city, having enough money, you know, being able to think fancifully about how one wants to live, and in fact making industries that would kind of support that idea, and ultimately imagining that you could do that in the Cotswolds. You know, there's just nice places in the countryside still where you can carve out a nice little place to live, and everyone can live comfortably, or at least pretend that you could lobby for that activity. So this is a question that in the 19th century, of course, is quite fanciful on the one hand. On the other hand, is certainly part of, you know, American Manifest Destiny is sort of part of that. The idea that you have a frontier and that you can bring both the cosmopolitan life of the city with you, and also seek something that's a little bit more ideal. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Serving themselves of the philosophical worldview of the times, which recognized in man a Promethean force as a metaphor identified with growing technological capability that is capable of conjuring up a different future for itself. These different thinkers envision the creation of a space subtracted from the blind capitalist drive, a utopia in a very tangible sense, where the hypothesis of political equality was articulated as the collective strive to organize, both socially and economically, a self-sustaining community. So a lot of people have this idea in mind. It is the product of things you take political science courses for, that is to imagine that people are concerned about governance. Firstly, in an age where you begin to see more individualism and the protection of individual rights develop in various places, the idea that you can extend these to larger bodies of governance, and in fact guarantee that governance to an entire nation. You know, everybody should have a vote, for example. So Fourier's phalansteries is an example that actually you could say spread. It's not a widespread idea, but you can see with the idea that you can introduce this into the kind of general discourse of organization, particularly in a world that seems to be on a colonial path to expansion. You can put this formulation to the test, creating several isolated communities with varying degrees of duration and social stability. So what is a phalanstery or phalanstery, whatever, Charles Fourier imagines that you can, you know, it is a kind of cultural narcissism, as it were. You kind of want all your friends around you. It, you know, at one level, it's just, you know, who do you want to interact with more often than with the outside world? A kind of important leisure life. Now, needless to say, people like even Rosa Luxemburg have a comment on this idea of idealizing these kinds of things. And of course, it has its critics. So this is Rosa Luxemburg commenting on Fourier, Charles Fourier. Fourier's scheme of changing by means of phalansteries the water of all the seas into tasty lemonade was surely a fantastic idea. But Bernstein, proposing to change the sea of capitalist bitterness into a sea of socialist sweetness by progressively pouring into it bottles of social reformist lemonade, presents an idea that is merely more insipid, but no less fantastic. So needless to say, she wasn't interested in the kind of moderation, the kind of entryist that socialism would evolve eventually for whatever kind of positions of faith without any kind of real analysis of the problematic elements of capitalism. So you could say that that this system that Fourier was thinking about is a communistic utopian system for the reorganization of society, Fourier argues that the universe was so created that there is a harmonious connection between the organic and inorganic, between man and God, between man and the world, and between the world and the universe. Human passions are unchangeable. With due allowance for the variety of individual aptitudes and abilities, they may be brought to an equilibrium or harmony. For this purpose, Fourier wished to create phalansteries, social units of some 1,600 persons who would divide their labor according to their natural inclinations and abilities. Thereby, the artificial restraints of ordinary civilized life would be destroyed, while a systematic agricultural society would be created in which all could live as one family and yet retain many individual rights. Albert Brisbane, Horace Greeley, and Parker Goodwin were the principal figures in developing Fourierism in the U.S. The best-known colony was the North American Phalanx. Brook Farm was for a time a Fourierist, and a colony was founded in Texas by Fourier's chief disciple, Victor Considerant. The movement had a temporary vogue among U.S. reform groups, but declined after the 1850s. You can argue for a lot of different reasons why this decline existed. Needless to say, this is one of a variety. There's good literature on this about, sort of utopian societies being created in the United States. Some manage to survive in a variety of forms. You could say that the Amish are kind of like that. The Mormons, for example, if you have a significant and tight enough ideology and a big enough, critical mass, you can propagate certain kinds of ideas. Now, whether individual rights are retained in that context is a whole different question, but you can see that in the 19th century, this set of ideas as America sort of expands from the East, as it were, that these are part of that kind of idea. This is a plan of what the 1600 might look like of a Fourier example. With all these experiments what all these experiments have in common, as the authors of the Communist Manifesto remind us, is that due to the undeveloped state of the proletariat, as well as to the absence of the economic conditions for its emancipation, at the time, the concrete determinations of their concept of equality came from either the historical past or from religion and morality. This is why, you have these kinds of, either you need to, worship Jim Jones, or you need some other thing that's going to, bind you together, whether it's an ideological condition or some other set of beliefs or ideas, or things about race, for example. Blacks could not, be bishops until 1968, I think, in the Mormon Church, for example. Therefore, these times of universal excitement, when feudal society was being overthrown, gave rise to an idea of communism based on ethical communal values rather than on the material conditions increasingly determined by the capitalist mode of production itself. I mean, what is the optimal size, for these kinds of things? What all these experiments have in common, as the authors of the Communist Manifesto remind us, is that due to the undeveloped state of the proletariat, these things, existed. And so, it's locatable within our schemata that there are two possible ways that one can respond to the failure of a communist experiment, taking it either as further proof that there can be no such thing as an egalitarian society, or as further conditions which must be critically taken into account by any attempts to turn the communist hypothesis into a new determined idea. Remember, we're still back to this idea where we have an hypothesis, an idea, the experiment itself, and then some conclusions about it, whether you can get an alternative, hypothesis proposed. And it's not about alternative facts. It is about something else. And facts are irrelevant in that particular context when you get to concrete reality. Engels would later term their own reformulation of the communist hypothesis the idea of scientific socialism. There's a whole variety of literature on this question of what counts as a quote-unquote scientific socialism. The word scientific, of course, to actual scientists can be somewhat problematic in that context, but, it does apply in a variety of ways. And yes, this is the same period when the idea of a human science is important. And we can see that this new idea answers both to the affirmative declaration that against all odds, real equality is in fact possible under a given set of historical conditions, namely the fully developed capitalist world, and to the negative assessment of previous communist experiments, which from an analysis based on a scientific and objective critique of political economy failed for believing that both the agents and the resources for socialism would have an origin or place outside of the capitalist system. This is this issue that you see in a variety of ways, right? You could say that the company town is a kind of utopia on the one hand. On the other hand, it's determined by who owns the company town. As the critical assessment of how many different forms the idea of communism took during the last century is far from a subtle debate. So, there's a whole bunch of discussions of what versions of this, and we leave this exercise open as proof of the model's usefulness, only noting that the idea, experiments, and failures of scientific socialism could be easily inscribed in the critical cycle we have proposed here, that is, idea, experiment, and hypothesis. Instead, let us shift our attention to the immediate present, as Badiou's critical model also allows us to locate our current predicament within the history of the communist hypothesis. So this is this reason why we think about the commons, because the commons always has these kinds of issues. In America, we allow for speech within that particular context. And you can see how it's facilitated on the one hand and constrained on the other, right? So-called free speech areas designated in front as protest areas in front of civic buildings or in public space, for example. In recent years, the political problem of the commons has offered itself as a historical determination capable of igniting new formulations of the communist idea. There have been, in fact, two interrelated movements leading to this. On the one hand, a philosophical tendency has emerged, especially among continental thinkers seeking to elaborate a new theory of equality, one in which thinking what is common among certain elements does not require these elements to be equivalent or identical in any sense. While on the other hand, new critical analyses of our economic and political predicament have highlighted the continuing importance of so-called primitive accumulation in the era of financial capitalism. That is, the centrality of the enclosure of the commons to the current forms of reproduction of capitalist social relations. Now, this is, kind of where what Harvey is talking about is this question that is arbitrated in space. Whereas theories of equality, that is that first example, is problematic because when Bezos gets divorced, it's no different than when people with not quite the same income get divorced, and well, that's just not the same. It's just simply not the same. And then, of course, when people like Musk have 10 children with multiple sometimes actual wives and actual not wives, you can see how problematic the comparison can be relative to the standard set of cultural norms. So anyway, a new communist idea can emerge, I think, from the combination of each of these two movements. That is, the different philosophical stances provide diverse ontological commitments, that is a kind of large-scale social commitment of each conjuncture analysis, that is where they interact, different versions of a new communist idea. But why do the commons authorize us to speak again of communism as a determinate idea? And so this is where Polanyi comes in. In his famous The Great Transformation, Polanyi distinguished market economy from capitalism proper by first distinguishing between commodities that are the products of human labor and those elements which condition the sphere of production, but were not produced by it. So there's this subtle difference among the three major factors of production, land, labor, and money, that are not identical, but whose equivalence kind of intersects and can be made problematic. It is the terms of those, problematic interactions that we spend most of our time fussing over. A copy of The Great Transformation by Polanyi has been uploaded to the file section in Discord, so that it's a complete copy, all 300 and some odd pages of it. So if you want to read it, it's worth reading. It's important that you read. It is one of the books I would assert is important to read relative to great books or stuff you need to know when you get out of college, whatever. I would assert that it's really a key text in explaining all of these different things. Land is to be understood here as the general resources of nature, which are in some sense given to us. Land, but also water, air, and so on. So, it's not just dirt. It's the elements. Labor should also be understood not as a specific type of capacity, but the active forces of men in general, though it remains a heated debate among Marxists if such a thing should be called labor at all. This is where Code of Capital comes in, where Postone is important in a variety of cases. This is that problem of critiquing the labor theory of value. And thirdly, the inclusion of money into this triad might seem at first counterintuitive, because it is, of course, a kind of commodity form in and of itself and problematic for all the usual reasons. But Polanyi was clearly not suggesting that coins or whatever material support money requires is not man-made, but rather that money depends primarily on a symbolic form of exchange, which is not a product of labor. This is that separation between labor and money, but rather an expression of a more general human resources, which is language. That is, money is a cultural construction, certainly, and requires and functions and is structurally similar to, and there's a whole literature on this, of the relationship of language and money as being culturally produced. The problem, of course, is the other variations on it, its articulations as wealth or credit or debt or whatever. For Polanyi, the passage from a market economy to a capitalist system is defined by the inclusion of these three resources into the commodity forms. This is not a new idea, as Polanyi was the first to recognize from Marx himself that had analyzed the system of bourgeois economy in terms of the three great classes into which modern bourgeois society is divided. The commodification of labor, giving rise to wage labor, that's something that differentiates labor. The commodification of land to landed property and of money, who owns what stuff, and of money to capital. Polanyi was rather interested in the special or paradoxical character shared by these fictitious commodities. This is why this is a key element. And note, of course, that David Harvey talks about this as well, as Marx does, of course, in a lot of places. Since none of them comes to being through commodity-producing labor, neither land, labor, or language is inherently commodified. That is, something readily alienated in the act of exchange, which means that something must be done to these resources so they might acquiesce to the value form and hereby be placed in substitutive relationships in the market. So this is simply a further articulation, and this is the labor problem, as it were, that labor power can be both tangible and intangible, and knowledge is, I think, a one element of that. This is where fiction comes in. That's the only way to ensure the adequacy of these domains to the rules of commodity exchanges by previously guaranteeing their status as private property through extrinsic and forceful means. These common resources had to be enclosed. That is, people had to be deprived of the free access to them either through laws or direct violence, so that with the mediation of the state, they could begin to be treated as exchangeable goods. In the most simplistic of models, it could be Scrooge McDuck and his money bin, but it's a little bit more complicated than that, of course. And you can see issues about extrinsic and forceful means being reacted to by libertarians who don't want people to get their stuff. But it is that question of what counts as private stuff, personal stuff, or public stuff that is increasingly important. Noting, of course, how many guns do you really need, for example? The clarification of this essential interplay between property form and value form, between state and capital, in the historical constitution of the capitalist mode of production allowed Polanyi to displace the worn-out ideological polarization between free capitalist markets and state regulation. It's still what we fight about, so-called free trade, free markets. and regulation and deregulation. But even if his own immediate objective was to intervene in this particular debate, the theory of fictitious commodities has broader consequences, which directly relate to the struggle over a new determination of the communist idea today. This is this thing that we were looking at before, and Higginbottom was talking about in terms of capital. That is, it is this appearance reality problem, or being an essence problem. As philosopher Slavoj Žižek writes, it is not simply enough to remain faithful to the communist idea. One has to locate within historical reality antagonisms, this is his key word, which give this idea a practical urgency. Now, antagonisms, as a sidebar here, antagonisms does have that crisis element, a kind of anxiety built into it. And this is a reference to Zizek's own interest in Lacan's version of psychoanalysis. So this is more complicated and is not simply about being antagonistic. But anyway, the only true question today is, do we endorse the predominant naturalization of capitalism, that is, make it conventional? Or does today's global capitalism contain antagonisms which are sufficiently strong to prevent its infinite reproduction? So, Zizek is essentially raising the same question about crisis, and in a slightly different form and with greater, sort of possibility than what Marx is doing with this idea that capitalism comes to a kind of a crisis naturally, that is kind of as if it were like a physical science, that it always comes to a kind of a chaos or whatever. There are four such antagonisms. Number one, the looming threat of an ecological catastrophe. Number two, the inappropriateness of the notion of private property in relation to so-called intellectual property. This is big deal. This is what, cynically speaking, our problem with China. Number three, the socio-ethical implication of the new techno-scientific developments, especially in biogenetics, right? Bioengineering, cloning, etc., AI. And last but not least, the creation of new forms of apartheid, that is, new walls and slums. So this fits nicely into what Kelly was talking about before, the weaponization of architecture in the case of Israel-Gaza. This is, apartheid divisions are no different than the apartheid of South Africa, the creation of ghettos by the Germans, the developments of concentration camps, which we know from our earlier history go all the way back into various other elements, and they are all, without giving too much credit to Foucault, carceral. That is, it is constraining people's bodies or regulating them or controlling them. And so Foucault's biopolitics still sort of lurks in somewhere on the edge. There is a qualitative difference between this last feature, that is the gap that separates the excluded from the included. We're just talking about that in terms of Gaza. And the other three, which designate different aspects of what Hart and Negri called the commons, the shared substance of our social being. And you can see that the commons is this contestable problem for so many people. What the struggles in all these domains share is an awareness of the potential for destruction, up to and including the self-annihilation of humanity itself, should the capitalist logic of enclosing the commons be allowed to run free. In a way that resonates with Marx's and Polanyi's characterization, Zizek distinguishes between the commons of culture, the immediate socialized forms of cognitive capital, primarily language, and we see this division every day. The commons of external nature, our natural environment, and the commons of internal nature, the biogenetic inheritance of humanity. And so these three things are, can be divided or made problematic by each of these kinds of elements. And you can see that eugenics is one example of this simple thing. Our migration crises are another example of these things. and frankly, some really problematic divisions. The desire of the Russians, at least in public statements, to eradicate Ukrainian culture, eradicate the Ukrainian language. They're certainly trying to do that, and to prove, because for a certain, visual ideographic evidence, more people speak Russian in a certain place, therefore that must be Russia. Well, that's just stupid, considering that people have the ability to move around. And you can use a counter argument that in 1991, all of Ukraine, that is every oblast, wanted to separate from the former Soviet Union. To this he adds, highlighting its centrality and qualitative distinction, the enclosure of people through new forms of apartheid. This is that fourth kind of condition. Our ultimate object in this essay, finally he gets to the point, is to reconstruct the theory of the commons from the standpoint of this fourth antagonism, a form of enclosure that should not be solely defined by walls and spatial constraints it imposes, but also, and even more profoundly, by the way in which this process leads to an expropriation of our capacity for self-estrangement. In other words, political consciousness is being developed in every moment by these kinds of more physical divisions. However, for such broader reconstruction to be possible, we must begin by analyzing the historical transformations which affected one of Polanyi's three special commodities: the shift in the role of labor in the productive process, and what has been called the crisis of value. Now, this gets to the kind of key element that current, Marxist historiography or Marxist thought is kind of fiddling with. And of course, it's not that it's chosen sides. I think everyone is more ecumenical now than it was before, but there are clear divisions and controversies. The crisis of value. In Marx's formula for capital, presented early on in the first volume of Capital, we have the cycle M, MP, LP, C. We have the expanded version of capital, which we've talked about before. Is this MCM, with the M divided into means of production and labor and labor power, MP and LP. I think these could be made more complicated, but we try not to make them more complicated. The first thing to note is that there's a reason why LP is set aside as a separate variable. As we've seen, labor is a special sort of commodity. For Marx, commodities are valued by the socially necessary labor time to produce them. This is one of the first issues of looking at necessary, the difference between use and exchange value. That is, what is socially necessary, which means that if on average one takes 2 hours of work to produce a coffee mug, the extra 6 hours it took me to make a similar one due to my personal artisanship or lack thereof will be simply not be absorbed by the commodity I produce. It will be worth the same 2 hours of labor as every other coffee mug of that kind. Now, that's a very simple example of the difference between mass production and craft production and artisanal production. And this is an overly simplified version of this, but you can see that you can build entire art movements around these kinds of activities, and also a critique of technology on that same issue. You can blame the machines for doing all this, creating this problem, and therefore you throw your sabot, into to create sabotage, to break the machines. It's not about breaking machines. It's about this social relationship, and this is what Marx is trying to measure, or at least identify what you should measure, and that is this idea of labor power. In short, well, I don't want to get too far into this, but it is this idea that you create these kinds of fictitious values underlying this. And without getting way down into this, because I only have a couple of minutes left, we worked through these differences of different, that labor power can be measured, and a surplus can be excised from that. It can be measured at some level by hour, but it is also built in with a bunch of other contingencies that also create, and that they change with scale. It's also important that this is not one person, an individual, for which this applies, but rather groups of people wherein individuals are incorporated in these ways. This is clearly a scalar argument, not an individual one. Although you could probably do that if you enslaved a single person, I suppose you would get a surplus, and you do in some ways. That's kind of Robinson Crusoe and the slave Friday. But we know that the reality, of course, was different. It was not, this is simply a fictional construction that in the original historical case where someone was marooned, there were actually interactions with a variety of people. There was no simply one guy on the island and one slave, which is the way it gets translated in fiction. So anyway, this is the tail end of the article, without going into the difference between absolute surplus value and relative surplus value, knowing, of course, that this difference is important. It represents the way in which surplus product is produced. That is, surplus value is produced. This difference between the absolute, that is looking at the whole day or adding to the whole day, and the work itself, a variety of the processes that are part of that. So Marx is trying to make this easier. He's creating an abstraction, of course, of the idea, but he's also trying to see, well, let's see how this kind of works in reality. And Marx spends this considerable amount of time in arithmetic, kind of trying to see how this works in as simple a mathematical way as possible. Now, this is the tail to two paragraphs, and I'll stop. All of this leads us to formulate the hypothesis that the main presentation of this antagonism of the commons of external culture today is not the concrete division of our social space, but rather the monopoly of the empowering dimension of social alienation in the hands of the managers and technicians responsible for keeping already existing social structures in place today. Okay, the easy way to think about this is that, you know, it's not just the walls that divide Palestinians and Israelis. This is about who's in charge of this. And it is clear that it's asymmetric. I mean, if Hamas had exactly the same military power, combat power, as the IDF, it would be even on the one hand, but then they probably would not even attack each other. I mean, and I know that gets into a whole bunch of other things that we could talk about in terms of balance of power, blah, blah, balance of terror. But the idea here is that there are various asymmetries. That is, the monopoly of the empowering dimension of social alienation is in the hands of the managers and technicians responsible for keeping already existing social structures in place. The premise, accepted by leftists and conservatives alike, though to the benefit of the latter, that alienation is always an oppressive and treacherous force, ultimately antithetical to our human nature and freedom, constitutes a sort of subjective enclosure. This is where the enclosure idea is being applied, a less tangible enclosing, so social enclosure, if you will, the deactivation of the political potential of certain formal tools which have the vocation of exposing us to our own inhuman excess, which Marx called our generic being, and whose unemployable quality is equally subtracted from value, property, and communitarian relations. And this is the last paragraph of the article, or Marx's German ideology, that the ideas are in every epoch the ruling ideas. This is what hegemony is built on. Perhaps when considered from our current perspective, this slogan could be given a new reading. For ideology is not simply the process of assumption of an ideal that is overdetermined by the social situation, but also an operation through which we are brought to abdicate from certain aspects of social reality, among them tools for effective social transformation, which, rejected in the name of preserving one's identity, become the exclusive property of our political adversaries. What? You look Jewish, whatever. In this sense, the proposition that the ruling ideas are those of the ruling class does not state that certain ideas rule over us because they inherently reflect the interests of the ruling class, but rather that the ruling class has the monopoly of ideas which have the power to rule over social processes. That is, those practices which concern the transformation, construction, and maintenance of a social order. Hopefully, I don't need to tell you, to show you, to just simply identify it. And it's an underanalyzed, as far as I'm concerned, that Jim Crow is exactly that crime that exists, that it is this power to rule over social processes. The very fact that the struggle against the enclosure of the commons of external culture can only be practically conducted through concrete political experiments whose genericity is only truly put to the test if the formal force of collective organization is capable of extending itself to those walled off places excluded from the capitalist forms of social reproduction. It seems to endow the communist hypothesis with a possible historical and concrete determination. And lest you think that this is unimportant, that is, the weaponization of architecture in the case of Israelis and Palestinians is no different than certain assholes in North Carolina who wish to prevent you from going to the bathroom. In other words, the rules they would love to put into place are that you have to carry ID in order to take a shit, whatever, to be much more crude about. Anyway, that's all I have to introduce on this section of that one little article, that is the unemployable and the generic rethinking the commons in the communist hypothesis. And my little final note here is in mentioning Greeley and Horace Greeley and Go West Young Man, that the actual person who Horace Greeley purportedly told to go West Young Man and grew up with the country was actually Josiah B. Grinnell, founder of Iowa's Grinnell College, originally called Iowa College, that is the College of Iowa. It's unfortunate that J.B. Grinnell, in the interest of the social gospel, and not that he was going to create anything perfectly ideal, but he was imbued with the notion of the late 19th century movement called social gospel, that J.B. Grinnell only went 120 some odd miles west of the Mississippi. So he didn't really go very far west, which is well, at least for me, is a running joke about my alma mater. All righty. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Please talk. I left only 1 minute to spare. I just happen to like working that in with the alma mater only because that was the sort of folklore that we were presented with as undergraduates. For which some of, we didn't get as JB didn't get as far as Des Moines even. God.
Question I had.
Yes,
can
please.
You hear me? Yeah.
Larry.
So the at the beginning it was, there's this hypothesis and then experiment, and then I guess you look at the results. And part of me is like, these weren't like actual experiments, It's sort of.
No. Well, yeah. I mean, you didn't have to file a grant and a a human subject thing. No.
Right, but it's an experiment nonetheless.
Well, like the democratic experiment. I mean, it is an
Right,
experiment.
yeah, that's a good example, right? So yeah,
that this is, but among most of us who might think that we do a social science, is that these are large scale activities that have much more structural implications than kind of doing actual scientific method sort of stuff with it's to go beyond sampling. It's to try and affect larger units, populations, rather than samples.
Oh right, yeah.
Of course, it is the problem that people who believe in apartheid, that's their experiment, right? I mean, apartheid notions, and it's been difficult for the Israeli, and the Israelis don't cop to it, but it is apartheid that they're practicing.
Right. That's kind of their experiment, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
Or
I mean, it has a history. I mean, you got whole, centuries of religious doctrine to support it, right? And the
yeah.
problem is when you rely on religious documents to determine public policy, right?
Yeah. Well, part of me is like, we've done these experiments. Don't we have like a past set of experiments to rely upon with the Roman Empire crumbling,
Oh,
and look for similarities there?
of course, but there are constantly people who want to erase or revise, to retcon history.
Right.
For example, Mike Johnson claiming that the fall of the Roman Empire was because they were gay. They had gays.
Right.
He said that last week.
Right. It's like a revision. Every statement they make is a revision.
Well, this is that problem with the experiment. You got to get all your variables, together.
So
Go ahead.
this go west young man is like one of those rules that sort of perpetuates one of these antagonisms, right?
Well, manifest destiny. It's white people moving west rather than indigenous people who are actually there all the time.
Right. Yeah, and so I was thinking, one of the ones that I chased was get a house, young man,
Oh yeah, and it's de rigueur, right? I mean, it's built into public policy with the FHA, for example,
Yeah.
loans to veterans, etc. Veterans don't like being told that they're part of a welfare system, but they are.
Right.
I mean, you just have to cop to it. I mean, if the Israelis would cop to the fact that it is apartheid, and there's no way that they can get out of that. It's apartheid. They built ghettos. Why did they build a ghetto? It's stupid. I mean,
Yeah,
don't they have enough historical memory to? It's just the irony is far too weird.
well, yeah, to me that sort of spells, reveals the power of I don't know, the myth or the charade, the power of distraction.
Oh yeah, and they prop up this other thing that they are the quote unquote only democracy in the Middle East. Some people prop that up. I don't, you know, it's unclear to me whether there is any democracy in the Middle East relative to state power, but whatever.
Oh, yeah, even in that, there's almost like I guess the antagonism, right? It's like saying, oh, well, these other people aren't capable of democracy.
Oh yeah. Well, we've got to bring it to them. This is that missionary thing. Still, that's the liberalism of the 19th century. These poor primitive savages need to have civilization brought to them.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what colonialism is, right? It's like, we shouldn't give them machines. God, no, it's our machine, right? We just the natural resource. Thank you for the question, Larry. It's always important to work this out.
Yeah, sorry, I don't.
Biologically.
They're not well formed. They're kind of
Oh,
meandering, but
better dialogue than no dialogue. Better
yeah,
no dialogue than monologue.
and thank you for bringing.
I mean, this is not unique stuff. I mean, a lot of people have come up with this stuff. Badiou is only one way of framing the argument. There's a variety of other theories, philosophies, whatever. I just happen to have, a preference just simply because Badiou has a certain set of organization that he prefers that I happen to like, since it kind of fits in with other stuff, other methodologies.
Yeah, that really helped me when it fits.
I mean, I could explain this from a deconstructionist point of view, but then people would get lost in all the kind of jargon. This has less jargon. To me, it's less jargon. This is all more easily quasi, social science sort of stuff, human science stuff.
Well, and the more ways that I come to this or hear about, the better better I'm off.
Oh yeah, I mean, we don't necessarily hitch our wagon to one or small groups of these things. That the Marxist project as a research program is a very wide and a broad and deep program. It's very problematic. It has all kinds of little glitches and heresies and other individualized bourgeois selfishness built into it.
Because we're people, right? Yeah.
Yeah, or this is my, this is the spot I've carved out in academia. Therefore, I'm going to protect it. And my army of graduate students will protect this for generations further.
I like your point about needing an ID to take a shit.
Indeed. Well, that's where we are. No, that's what they were. This is an idea that is now a decade in proposal. They brought this up a decade ago that in North Carolina you should have to show an ID in order to. You have to prove that something, whatever, that your biology matches your appearance.
That's why I had to pee in the bushes the other day.
You're a libertarian. What the hell, man?
If it affects my social credit score, I'm in debt.
Yes. Yes, indeed. Some of us are in trouble.
God.
Well, we start off with like a negative balance,
Oh yeah, naked and afraid, right? Whatever.
No, it's like figure skating. You start with a perfect score, and the minute that you step on,
yeah, it's always deductions. Stylistic deductions, needless to say.
Oh, do a style.
Well, yeah, it was one of these things where I was on a walk and I was anticipating being able to go to the bathroom at a certain point, and then it turned out that I wasn't allowed to use that bathroom, right?
Been there, done that.
I'll tell you who chews with style. Finally.
Oh,
That's a horse.
Oh, indeed.
They just keep on going. Like nothing happens.
It just pops out. Well, the birds are like that too. I mean, they just
a bit. Yes. They do like to aim though. They can be nasty birds. They do like to aim for the noggin. Yeah.
Well, I think there are no other questions, comments, brickbats. I think we're over. Joe, if you're still up, I think it's let me thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
And 7 o'clock is writers workshop, and after that sports game time.
Wait a minute, isn't there
something else? There's something else.
Yes, I think there's Fear and Loathing.
Oh, Nate will
Fun and Loathing.
Fun and Loathing will entertain us with large language models. Oh, I think Joe is going to be doing this at yes, interested.
Oh, Joe is gonna be doing the fun and loathing?
I think so.
If he can stay awake, he said.
There we go. So we'll see. Yeah, Joe, I think you can shut off the